Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And we're doing something a little bit different today. It's the first one we've done that isn't on a conventional movie. We're talking about an art installation called The Clock.
Yes.
Which is pretty well known, and it's kind of popular whenever it comes around. It's been around for about 10 years. And it's by Christian Marclay, who's an artist. We saw this at the Tate. It's been there for the last couple of months. It's actually just finished by the time this will go out.
Yes.
You went down a few times to see it.
I saw it 4 times.
And I went down just once. I saw it...
Twice? You went twice?
Well, I went down the once, but I went in twice.
Okay.
I mean,
in that case...
I made the trip to London once.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it was on at the Tate Modern.
Yes. So I had 4 visits.
Yeah.
I went once with my sister and my brother-in-law. I went once more with Nikki, my friend. And then I went twice with you. Yeah,
last weekend.
Last weekend. Friday evening and Saturday morning.
So, what The Clock is a 24-hour long film. It's a supercut, really. Supercuts are kind of a YouTube thing where you'll get, like, every time Dr. House insults his staff, for instance, and it'll be taken from every single episode of House and cut together very quickly. And it just shows you kind of one aspect of something. And they're normally done for comedic effect. They're little fun things to look at. There's one I really like, which is Claire Danes doing the cry face, where she weeps in everything that she's in, and it cuts together all of those. It has a relationship to that. But what it does is take, mainly from film, also from TV, shots of clocks and watches, and occasionally people telling the time, talking about the time. And it synchronises them to the real hour of the day. So you go in, it had a few 24-hour through the night showings, but mainly you can mainly just see it when the Tate was normally
Between
open.
10 and 10.
Between 10 and 10 at the weekend, which is when we saw it last weekend. And so you go in at 10 in the morning, and then you see clips of films synchronised to the real clock. So you see stuff happening at 10 in the morning, 10 past 10, 20 past 10, and so on. And the clock is constantly, as in the clocks in the film, are constantly foregrounded. You're constantly looking for them. There's a kind of a game aspect to it, which I quite liked, which was occasionally the shot would be straight of the clock and you just see it and you know it was 25 past 10. But sometimes the shot would have nothing to do with the clock. You'd see someone walking around a house and you'd go, where's the clock in this? And then right at the end, the camera would pan and there'd just be a grandfather clock and you go, there's the clock.
Yes.
I think that's quite good fun, and it recontextualises things that you see.
So I suppose the central idea is that this film is not only about clocks and indeed about time, but is itself a clock. You can keep time by the time in the installation.
Roughly speaking.
Yes.
Yeah, because as we noticed, we talked about this a little bit before, and one of the things we noticed was there are times when there are more clips to choose from, and there are times when there's very few. So on the hour, you tend to get a preponderance of clips. Things happen on the hour. People meet up, or people are late, or there are deadlines, or things like that.
Yes.
So there are more clips to choose from. I remember when I saw it at 8 o'clock in the evening, and 8 o'clock itself took about 2 minutes to do. Do you know what I mean? And then it kind of jumped forward to 8:02 and 8:03. And there are some times when it seems that they haven't actually managed to get a clip at all, and it builds. There's a conflict within the film between how down the line it wants to take its own brief, and how kind of exactly it wants to follow itself.
I don't know.
And I think when it's a little bit more free and it cuts around itself and actually does a bit of filmmaking, that's when I liked it more.
I think there are a lot of episodes like that, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that the film is more formally daring and innovative and playing around with different things than just keeping time.
Go
on. Well, I mean, it's kind of... I mean, we discussed earlier some of the problems in terms of how the clips are knit together, right? So we couldn't figure out what ratio the film was using, but it seemed to be like some halfway ratio between 1:3:3 and a wider screen. So it's filling the space, and it's making all of the clips that it chooses kind of the same so that it doesn't kind of jump around. So, and that has the effect of altering the shots of the films in which the audience is getting pleasure from either recognizing or loving, right?
Yeah.
So kind of most of the compositions are ruined, really. So kind of what you're seeing is a fragment of a film that you love or recognize or are curious about, right? So now, that's kind of just one of the problems that we noticed. But the film is also kind of making you pay attention to particular things. So some of the times it edits actually on images, not on just the time, right? So, I remember, this whole segment, which was just about cigarettes, and packs of cigarettes.
Yeah.
There was a segment which was just about pocket watches.
Yeah.
So, and the film is kind of doing, I suppose, all these formal experiments on, you think you've watched the clip, and then the film kind of inserts other clips, and then it returns back to the film that I noticed the most, or that seemed to crop up the most in the hours that I watched, was Laura. Otto Preminger's Laura. So kind of it kept going back to that film over various sequences, and it kept using the music from the film, and actually sometimes it put the music of the film in other sequences where it was not the music from, and very, very evidently it sometimes used the music of the end of the 400 Blows, which is like really instantly recognizable, and placed it on something else. I forget now what, right? Kind of very disjunctive.
Yeah.
So I think the film is kind of doing all kinds of formal games. It's playing with things and how you see that don't just have to do with,
That's one of the things.
Supercuts.
As I said, this is one of the things that I liked. I liked when it's slightly moved away from that very kind of basic brief of telling the time. So the thing I'm thinking of is between the hours of sort of 7 and 8, you get people going out to the theatre, and there's meeting up on dates. And there's one, I don't know the film, but it's Nicolas Cage and Cher.
Moonlight.
Is it?
Where they go to see La Bohème.
Right. So they meet up on a date, and it starts off with an establishing shot in a square where she's waiting for him, and there's a public clock.
It's the Met. Yeah, they're going to the Metropolitan Opera in New York.
No, never seen Moonlight. So you see the clock, and that establishes whatever, it's 7:10. And then they meet up, and you cut away and you go to other things, and then you come back a little bit later, and the film is now showing you them taking their seats in the opera, and a little bit later you see them actually watching the opera, but there's no clocks in those bits. They're not checking the time or anything, so sort of in literal terms there's no reason for those shots to be there. They shouldn't be, because they don't fit the brief. But what the film's doing is intercutting them with lots of other shots of people taking their seats in various plays and operas and things, other people watching shows, other people meeting up on dates. So, and again, not all of those have the time in either, because it just wouldn't work. Not every film is going to do that at 7:10. But it builds a profile of a lot of people all meeting up in various places doing the same thing at the same time. Like, it brings people, it kind of, I don't know how better to say it than it kind of brings people together. That's a bit of a cliche way of saying it, but I think that's kind of the idea, right? It builds an idea of what people do. There are other points where people are all having dinner at the same time, or people are coming home from work at the same time, and it edits those together without paying attention to having to show you a clock to do that, which I think is quite effective. And the other aspect to it is, if you actually watch the film Moonlight, then I assume that happens. You cut from
Moonstruck.
Moonstruck. Sorry. I would assume that you cut from them meeting up to going into the place or whatever. Like in editing a film, you cut out the bits in between. You jump through the evening, and what this does is separate those bits in time. So you see them at 7:10 meeting up, and then you wait a while, and then it's 20 past where you catch up with them again, taking their seats. They've met up, they've had a drink or whatever. So you get a kind of a quite visceral feeling of the time passing and their evening kind of progressing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know.
There's one in the early morning as well with Jason Statham waiting for a train. It might be the transporter. Yes. And again, it shows you that it cuts away, it comes back, it cuts away, and you get again a visceral feeling of the time it's taking him to wait for this train.
Yes. Can we talk about some of the other problems in the film, I noticed that it's really built on a canon. Yeah, so it's built on a culture and then also a canon. So I recognized, I would say, over 90% of the
You're very
clips.
proud of that. That's another game aspect to it, I think, is just recognizing the
Yes,
clips.
it's because one of the wonderful things about the film is actually that it's drawing on cinephilia. It is about there's an aspect of it is how cultured are you? How many of these clips do you recognize, right?
Yeah.
And actually, in recognizing them, you also recognize what they're doing together. Yeah, what the editing is doing. I mean, sometimes actually, what the clock is doing is reliant on you knowing where those clips come from. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not always, but sometimes. And that's part of the pleasure of watching the film, of watching the clock, at least for me. But it was very obvious that most of the clips were from Hollywood. There's actually a very considerable amount of British content.
The biggest minority
Yeah.
in the film.
And quite a lot of that is also television, right? Kind of there were bits from The Prisoner and The Avengers I recognized, and so on. And then the rest is really what I would call, an Anglo-American canon. So you see some Ozu, you see some Bergman, you see some Satyajit Ray films, right? Nothing kind of surprises, right? Like, so, you can tell that, there's been no specialist in African cinema or something, that has been sent to look at clocks in the work of Sembene or something. And actually you feel it's quite marked.
Yeah, well, so the other thing I noticed to that, it was one of the first things I kind of really picked up on when I was watching it, is how white it is as well.
Yes.
It's not just that it's Anglo-American, but it's very white. There were a couple of clips. The first bit of it I saw was 7 till 10 in the evening, and there were a couple of clips of Do the Right Thing.
Yes.
It's Ice Cube and Chris Tucker, and they tell the time twice, and then just sit on the side just talking about the time, and they really stand out.
Yes.
Like, wait a minute, there's 2 black people there. I haven't seen black people in this thing yet. Like, it's not just that it's very Western, it's also very white. And the other aspect to what you're talking about is when a non-English language film is shown, it's not shown with subtitles.
Yes.
And on the one hand, I can sort of see the argument to say that, well, the subtitle shouldn't be important because it's not the specifics of what is what these people are talking about that is important. It's the generality of where they are and what they're doing. On the other hand, it disadvantages the clips. You can understand everything else if you only speak English.
But it particularly disadvantages the clips when the clips themselves are distorted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have
not distorted but cropped. So a couple were actually distorted.
To me, cropped is distorted, right? So there were some images from von Sternberg's The Scarlet Empress, and the lady from Shanghai, in fact, or Shanghai, I forget what the name is, where Marlene Dietrich's face, you can see she's kissing kind of these masks, right? And her face is sometimes cropped out of, partially cropped out of the frame because they need to elongate it to this kind of odd ratio that they have, right? So
there are a couple of shots that have actually been stretched, I noticed, but most of them are just cropped.
So,
which I'm not saying that's okay.
Well, I'm saying it's a distortion.
Okay, of sorts.
It's literally a distortion.
No, a distortion is actually
you say it's been stretched. It's distorted. So,
yeah, no, only a couple of them were actually stretched. That's the point I'm making. Most of them were cropped, not stretched.
Okay, in either case, so the stretched is definitely a distortion. The cropped is, a different image than was intended. So it also distorts
I agree with
what
that.
you think about.
But that's a separate point. That's a separate point to what I'm talking about, though. I'm talking about the way that not subtitling films from non-English language disadvantages them, and I think it does, because there's no way that this film, were it shown in Italy or France or Japan, would not be subtitled.
Absolutely,
I can't imagine that it wouldn't be.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it shows actually a disrespect. I think. For
I think it does have a kind of imperial attitude. Actually,
a little bit.
Well, I think it does. I mean, like
Yeah.
you said, I can't imagine this being shown in Bologna or Madrid, and actually all the English clips not having subtitles.
Exactly.
I just can't imagine that.
I agree.
Right. So, so the reverse seems to be okay here, and that is kind of offensive, actually.
On the other hand, maybe they wouldn't subtitle it and they would just assume everyone can speak English. I mean, that's a possibility. But certainly the English language films are privileged beyond everything else. Actually, to the point where there's such a... So there are definitely a few French, a few Italian. You see them kind of dotted around. And they come up like once every 10 or 15 minutes. You notice them.
That's what I mean
But
about
they're
the canon.
Yeah.
They're very famous ones, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's quite a lot of Truffaut that I noticed.
But they're very, very rare. But actually, I mean, so there was one, the Satyajit Ray, I think it was. It showed up once, and it's like literally the only Indian person I saw in it in the kind of 5.5 hours I saw of it.
Yes.
Which is kind of nuts.
Yes.
And the fact that they come along kind of so intermittently actually makes you notice them more. Like in a way, it might have been stronger. Or stronger is not the right word. It might have been more coherent and less of a problem had the film only worked with English language. Now, I'm not saying that would be a good thing to do, but the fact that I think that including non-English language films means that they should have taken up a much higher proportion. I can't imagine that people in Japan don't tell the time as often.
It's a very
as we do.
imperialist attitude.
So you notice their absence so much more by the fact that they turn up just a little bit. It reminds you that they're not there.
It's imperialist with all that goes along with it, because I also think it's racist, right? I mean, you could have made a deliberate choice to kind of include, clips from Latin American cinema, of which I didn't see any at all. Yeah. Or I didn't recognize any from, neither Mexico nor Argentina. I think there were a couple of Brazilian ones. But still, right, kind of, or Africa, very few from Southeast Asia and very few from Southwest Asia. That which doesn't make the canon, is absent from this film. And I think they could have made a deliberate kind of conscious choice, to be more inclusive in those ways.
I agree. And at the very least, if not, I think racism might be overdoing it. Certainly imperialism, it kind of hangs over it. But I think ultimately it speaks to a lack of imagination. It's basically like going to the IMDb top 200 and saying, like, look at all these in order, and only when you've found clips from those are you allowed to look at less important films.
Yes.
Or less popular films. That's it. So the fact that it doesn't basically put anything in you kind of wouldn't expect really is an issue. And let's talk about, like, okay, so we're talking about it having problems in that, but let's try and think about the overarching sort of point or aim of it, because it's only a problem if it kind of detracts from what it's trying to do. And I think the idea behind it, or one of the main ideas behind it, is to connect people. It's to show how people across eras and cultures are connected. It's not only between, like, films from the 80s and films from the 50s and films from the 30s. It's in where they're set. So there's a lot of westerns.
Yes.
But there's films set, kind of in pretty much every era that people were telling time.
Yes.
And I think the idea is to sort of cut between. There's one thing that the film does quite a lot, which is show someone picking up the phone,
yes,
and then it'll cut to someone on the phone in a completely different film answering, and it makes a little conversation out of that. And very often the way it does that is by showing. It's not only that they're in different films, but their films are from different eras. Normally, the one film is in colour and the other is in black and white. It cuts between them very starkly to kind of make this connection. Or someone will walk through a door in one film and a door will open in another, and someone else will emerge. So it connects through editing, and I think there is a project in it to basically show how deep down there's an underlying humanity to everyone. We're all the same in certain ways. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what era you lived in, at 7:30 you're having dinner with the family.
Well, I don't know. I kind of
which means that
let's be clear. I really loved it. I loved seeing it. I loved the cinephile games it plays. I loved recognizing the clips, or I loved asking things like, where was that Charles Bronson clip from that I don't recognize? Right, I haven't seen that film. All of that stuff I loved. I loved the formal exercises. I loved, that often it would cut on smoke, right? Or, you know, that it kind of returns, or, you know, the things with doors, or like, you know, what you're saying, kind of cutting through spaces. I loved the way that it sometimes kind of, you know, cut on point of view, right? Or it kind of redeployed sound, or kind of, you know, re-edited different sounds onto the images. I loved all of that. My problems are indeed, you know, what it chose to draw on and what it excluded. And this idea that, you know, we're all the same. Well, actually, in a way, the film is telling you, no, we're not all the same, because, you know, kind of Aryans are disproportionately represented in this. Like, the world is Aryan.
Well, exactly. That's what I'm getting to. What I'm saying is, if we're saying that the idea, or one of the ideas behind the film, is to kind of bring different peoples together.
We mustn't say film, because it's not really...
Okay, well, the project...
The installation.
Whatever. We know what we're talking about, though. If we're saying one of the ideas of the piece is to kind of connect peoples through these kind of commonalities, and through, ultimately, the time of day, then what we're saying is that everything we've talked about in terms of the problems with cultural representation are real problems, because they detract from it. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like, they're not just problems because they don't represent what we'd like to see.
I agree.
They're problems because they detract from the point of the film.
I agree.
The point of the art.
Though, you know, one of the pleasures of a film is also that it induces a kind of reverie, right? So if you're not too punctilious about, you know, the distorted imagery and the changes of ratio, if you're not kind of too purist about all of that, there is something about the rhythms of the clock that it makes that is fascinating. I was going to say lulling, because it is also lulling, but lulling in the best sense. Lulling not as in the sense that it lulls you to sleep, you know, but that it induces a kind of a calm enjoyment, really, you know.
You get lost, I think. So what I found is, I mean, when I first got there, it was very, very busy in the evening, so I didn't have a seat for 2 hours, and I was stood at the back. And I noticed the 2 hours I was stood up for, you know, my feet hurt. But at the same time, and the other thing is, you notice the time because it's on the screen for you. Like, you can't forget what time it is. The whole point of the thing is it's showing you the time. And yet, you find very quickly that time has passed.
Yes.
You know, so you're there between 7 and 8, and you go, Jesus, it was 7 o'clock a minute ago. Yes. It wasn't, you know. So where the film is most interesting and most active, when it has the most going on, it passes time very, very quickly and very easily and very naturally.
Yes,
but
I love
interestingly.
it.
I mean, the fact that it's cutting so starkly between films of different eras and types and whatever, and looks, you think it would kind of constantly be jarring, but it's not. I think it's not like you remain mentally active, right? It's not like you fall asleep watching it. Like, you're constantly thinking about what you're seeing, but the time just goes.
Yes, I thought so, and I did love it, actually. You know, so I'm pointing out all of these problems because I think they are, in retrospect, when you begin to think about the film, you know, and try to kind of make sense and kind of figure out what it's doing and so on, and the underpinnings of it. To me, these elements are problems. But at the moment of watching it, I was just fascinated and riveted, but also, you know, kind of, you know, lulled into this kind of, you know, hypnosis. Yeah, you know, kind of. I was really loving what I was seeing, and also the pleasure of watching it is because it moves from clip to clip, you know, whilst also kind of doing things with the clips, right? You're kind of so, you know, there was never a moment where I felt, oh, I'm bored, right? Because, you know, something happened and then it moved on to something else and then something else. And at each instance, so every 5 minutes or something, it would be touching on a different exercise, right? You know, so again, kind of my memory's not too good, but, you know, I keep going back to the thing about the smoke, or the clock, or the pocket watches, or the smoking and the ashtrays, or the opening of car doors, I remember as well, or the going to the theater, right? You know, so there would be sequences that would be like almost thematically unified, while also exploring some aspect of film form, you know, and I really was fascinated, really.
So I did like those, but I would kind of I would also say that for me, as much as I like those aspects of when it actually indulges in filmmaking and creative editing, to me they're too few and far between. You know, I think it's where the piece is at its best, but I don't think it's doing that often enough. And there's a whole. I remember between 11 and 11:30, nothing interesting happened.
Well, I mean, you know, let's be clear. I mean, I made 4 trips to the Tate to see this.
Yeah.
Right. So it interested me enough to go 4 times to one place.
Yeah, and I would see more of it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I was fascinated by this when I first heard about it about five or 6 years ago, and I actually never thought I'd get the chance to see it. You know, so I was thrilled to be able to. And my whole idea of the weekend was just see as much of it as I can.
Yes.
And then having seen that first 3 hours that I saw the first evening on Friday, when I went back in the morning on the Saturday, I thought, I'm not sure how into this I am. Which is why I said at 12:15, should we have lunch?
Yes.
You know.
Well, and I had seen from 12 to 2 previously, so I was quite happy. But I really regretted.
I was a little bit disappointed in my experience.
Well, no, I wasn't. And actually, I think had I been younger and not have to work and not have a lecture to give, you know, Monday morning, I would have done the whole nighter. I really wanted to. I mean, it was only the fear that it would wreck my body clock to the extent that I wouldn't be able to do my work properly. That's the only reason that held me back. I would have quite happily. I'm fast. I wish I could see, you know, the moments like from 12 to 8 a.m. You know, I think they're bound to be fascinating. I could imagine all the film noir bits and, you know, murder and crime,
I can imagine
vampires.
I can imagine they'd be very interesting, but I kind of feel like if someone were to tell me what happened, my experience would not actually be that impoverished. Like I'd be interested to find out what happened, but I don't think the experience is interesting enough.
Oh, well, I disagree with you. And actually, I found it so interesting that it's one of my pet peeves. You know, so, I mean, I have this whole rant that I wrote on my blog about, you know, the way that museums disdain cinema, right? So I had this experience where I went to the Queen Sofia Museum and film is everywhere, right? So they're quoting the Battle of Algiers, An American in Paris, you know, Lotte Reiniger's animated films. I mean, it's just an endless stream of films that they're showing. They were showing Almodovar's Dark Hideout, you know, as well. And the way they show it is so disdainful. Actually, the Dark Hideout bit just pissed me off because, you know, they just had like a computer screen that had ran out and in which the colors had run to pink because the bulb was going in a fully lit room, right? And kind of, so, you know, they're exploiting the meaningfulness and the beauty and the historical value of these films whilst showing them with the utmost disdain, right? They would never dare show, you know, a Goya by photocopying, you know, a bad picture from a book. And what they're doing with cinema is the equivalent of that, right? Like, they're showing them in fully lit rooms. They're often on a loop, you know, kind of, they're often projected in the wrong format. You know, they're often projected in really degraded versions, right? And often they're not using the film, you know, as a historical moment or a sociological instance, the way that they sometimes put a newspaper article under glass. They're not using films in those ways, actually, right? So it pisses me off, you know, it really does, that they spend hundreds of thousands of pounds transporting, you know, a painting and make sure that it's hung properly and lit properly, you know, and they agonize and they pay hundreds of thousands of pounds in insurance and so on. And then you have these great treasures of 20th century art and they treat them like shit. It pisses me off no end, right? And one of the things that connects with the clock is they built a special room. You know, they brought sofas. Yep. It's completely dark. You know, I kind of, the moments that I went in, especially with my sister, I could not see a thing. It's the way that movies are meant to be seen, right? It's the way that I wish museums would show movies properly, right? And instead, they undertake that expense, you know, to do a piece like The Clock, right, where they have special seating, a special room. It's beautifully projected. It's magic. Even though the way that The Clock, the piece itself, treats the cinematic heritage is quite disdainful. I think if you're cropping or stretching, you're pissing on film history. That's just, you wouldn't stretch, a Da Vinci. Yeah, you wouldn't crop a Da Vinci. Right.
One of the things that I liked particularly about the screening room was that when I was stood at the back, the thing is vast. It's almost like a fucking aircraft hangar. It's so big and long, this place, and the film is big right at the end, and obviously sitting up very close to it is great because it's so big and quite in front of you. But when I was stood at the back and I had kind of, I would say maybe 30 rows of sofas in front of me, and the sofas were white, so when something bright happened on the screen, they all reflected that. And it kind of showed up everyone.
Yes.
And it looked fantastic from the very back when that happened.
Yes.
It was worth it, despite the fact it hurt my feet. that was kind of great, and it emphasised, and that did show a kind of love for the image and love for the experience. And I remember because there's been talk about people want to buy it and stuff, and I think Christian Marclay has always said if you want to buy it, it comes with the room. That's what I've heard.
Well, that's great.
Never sourced that, but that's kind of.
It should also come with proper ratios.
Well, but I think part of the one of the good things as well about the experience, which kind of goes hand in hand with one of the other good things about the experience is that you are only allowed to watch it at the same time as the time of day.
Yes.
You can't go, I'm going to wind ahead to 8 a.m. to see what happens, and that's great because there's a couple of things. For one thing, while you're in the queue outside, I was in the queue for 45 minutes. You were in the queue for about 2 hours, weren't you?
Yes.
Huge queues on Friday.
On Friday night, it was terrible.
Yeah. But while you're in the queue, you're kind of imagining what's going on right now. You know the film is going on, and you kind of think, "Oh, what's happening now? It's 6 p.m. What's going on?" And then while you're in there watching it, you're very aware of the time because it's showing you the time, and at 7:30, people are having dinner, and you kind of imagine other people, real people in the real world, having dinner at the same time. You feel like, oh, this could be happening to me now. This is actually happening now somehow.
Yeah.
So I think it's great.
Yeah.
And it's directly tied to the fact that you can only watch it at the right time.
Yes.
You know what I mean? I think that's great. And again, that will be diminished.
Yes.
It wouldn't exist, if you're able to just watch it on DVD or whatever.
Yes, I mean, I think the experience for me.
You need to be able to imagine these things happening right now.
Yes, I think also. Well, we had a conversation about this where we disagreed, but to me, it really showed the value of film going. That being in this darkened room, with these glorious images. Generally in good copies, there were a few moments where they were clearly using quite degraded clips, but the bulk of them were really quite wonderful to see, and it just brought me joy. You were in the dark and you were riveted, and I was thinking of nothing else except what I was seeing in front of me, and I thought it kind of brought back the value of cinema. That kind of, you're alone, but you're with other people. You are conscious of other people's reactions, but on the other hand, kind of, the main thing in your sight is that where the light is coming from. You're looking at the light, and the light is leading you into kind of this. You're being enveloped in these glorious images, really, and unfolding in time. And I just kind of love that.
Did we disagree about that?
Yeah, I kind of.
What did I say?
Yeah, well, my feeling is that you didn't agree with that you thought it didn't kind of convey that experience of cinema.
Oh, well, I mean, I think there were elements about the experience that were impoverished because I was so disappointed in the film, really. Because I wasn't as enveloped by it as I wish I had been. And my expectations were very high. So that's an issue. I mean, I don't think I've not seen anything negative written about the film anywhere. It's been kind of positivity basically since it came out, since it was first, exhibited, sort of in 2010, I think. So that obviously sort of upped my expectations and set me up for a bit of a letdown. But I mean, in terms of the kind of the setup and all you say about just the joy of being in a cinema and the experience of kind of a shared yet individual experience, and that's kind of, I agree with that. I would disagree with actually the quality of the images. I think literally, I think too many of them seemed to be low quality footage somehow.
I think the differences between the TV clips, because there was quite. I noticed the Avengers, the Prisoner. There were a few Columbos, right, and you could instantly tell that it was like a degraded image. And sometimes some of them
almost seem to be taken off YouTube.
Some of them did look very degraded from films, but there were also fabulous ones, you know, and I really appreciated that. I mean, so we've had a lot of criticisms. But the fact is, it's the only artwork, it's the only time that I've returned to an exhibition 4 times. I mean...
But you always wanted to catch a different bit, didn't you?
Well, that's true. Though, actually, I was quite willing...
Like, imagine if you saw the Mona Lisa. Imagine if they showed you the bottom left quarter of the Mona Lisa and said, come back tomorrow, you can see the top right.
Listen, that's not comparable. And in fact, I would have been quite prepared to sit with you for another, because I think we'd agreed to stay until 1, and I'd already seen the 12, and I would have been quite happy to see it again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, to me, it was like a fantastic experience with all of the problems that we mentioned, which I think are real problems, and if it hasn't received any criticism, it should.
It certainly should. I think actually, as I say, my brother was talking to me about it as well. We saw him in the evening, and he said he reckons that people have been like reviewing the idea of the film more than the film itself or piece itself, which I think is true, because like the concept is so good.
Yes.
It's so good and it's captivating. Immediately you get it, you go, wow, imagine what that would be like, and actually there is plenty of room for significant criticism. But I haven't seen anyone give to it.
But to be fair, there were about 8 moments during the time that I watched it that I thought, oh my God, isn't this great? And actually, my problem is then I didn't write notes. So, I can't articulate now, what it was about the cutting or the juxtaposition or, the plays with sound or images or the way that it cut, that I thought was so great. So I just remember my feeling about it. But I trust my feeling about it.
Yeah, sure.
I actually, I wouldn't...
I trust mine as well.
Yes, well, I wouldn't denigrate it. I thought it was doing very, very interesting things, kind of formally, really.
I want to mention the use of sound as well, because I think there's a kind of central conflict, well, not conflict, but a difference between the way the film uses images and uses sound, and the way it manipulates them. So the images... Okay, we've talked about how they're cropped, and that's one issue. But the way they're cut is everything's done with a hard cut, right? So when one film is moved to another film, moved to a TV show, whatever, it's just hard cuts the whole way. And sometimes they cut very quickly, as I say, with those telephone conversation bits. They cut together. They're cross-cutting between one film and another, back and forth to create something new. And other times it's just you're cutting from one film to another because the time is moved on. But the sound fades. The sound doesn't cut with it. The sound very often fades, and they've mixed it. So the sound from maybe someone will be at a train station, and you'll hear the noise of the trains, and then as that cuts to someone else in a completely different situation, the sound of the trains will remain and fade out. It helps to smooth the process. I think that's the reason also that the film, that everything has been cropped to 1 aspect ratio, is to create a visual smoothness to it.
Yes.
Because I think the film is scared of cutting between widescreen and full frame and widescreen and a different widescreen. I think that wouldn't be that much of an issue, but I think that is why the film has done it, to smooth the experience of watching it. But then at the same time, that's also why the sound is faded the way it is, because again it smooths the experience. It's not abrupt cutting between, it's not sounds just being cut off. Which I don't have a problem with. I think, we talk about kind of respect for the films that it's showing, and that could be an issue of it as well, because, in blending the audio from one film into another, that is manipulating what the audio is, but I think the effect is a positive one. And, I think that what's happening is that the clock is qualitatively transforming the footage that it uses, into something else. And I think that's part of it. On top of that, the use of music, like you said, you mentioned things like the 400 Blows music kind of being overlaid over on top of other things. There are times when it's used to really great effect. I'm thinking particularly of in the 5 minutes before midday, you get a lot of shots of people checking their watches and checking clocks and things, and you go, are they going to turn up or whatever it is? You know, it's like meetings seem to happen at midday, and at one point there's a clip from Run Lola Run. I don't remember much about Run Lola Run, or I certainly don't remember the specifics of, but I think something must happen at midday in that film because that's why it shows up, and the techno music continues. It's not just that it fades into the next clip and fades out, it's that it continues for a minute or so, you know, like lots and lots of shots of people checking their watches, and this Run Loader Run and, you know, techno music is kind of amplifying everything and making it into like a chase sequence, like you're chasing down midday, you know, which is great. Actually, when midday arrives, I found that a bit of a disappointment because it's just loads of clocks during midday. But before then, it ramps up this fantastic anticipation using the soundtrack from one film over many others. Right. You know, anyway, I just think so. There's an interesting thing of how kind of the sound design. It's funny how we're talking about the kind of manipulation of the images as being kind of a negative, but the manipulation of the sound is to me an absolute positive. The film uses it to its benefit always.
It always does it in ways that incur thought, but again, it relies on you recognizing it. Or it often relies on you recognizing it. I think kind of the uses of the sound of the 400 Blows wouldn't have the same effect if you didn't recognize that it's coming from the 400 Blows.
Well, there's an element of that. I think there's certainly an element of recognizing things. I think the film does this with jokes as well. So I think, well, for one thing, there's like Inspector Clouseau. There's a joke about synchronizing watches. And, you know, the joke in the original film is that they can't synchronise their watches properly, and that's funny. And then there's like an added joke in the clock that it's happening at the actual time it is, you know. So, like, is this the real time? What's going on? Are they right or wrong? But there's another way that the film kind of tells jokes, which is, well, the one I'm thinking of is Back to the Future, because the thing about Back to the Future is that's all about time, and there are moments of Back to the Future where the clock is very important, particularly when I forget exactly the time it is, but it's when the lightning strikes the tower, and that's when they have the power to get back to 1985. So the film kind of uses that clock quite a few times, but because the clock, the film, the clock is kind of showing you like one day cyclically, and Back to the Future is in 1985 and 1955 and 1885, then it takes this trilogy of films that you know is all about travelling through time and somehow lays it out into one day, weirdly. So like, I mean, it was in the morning where I forget exactly what it was, but there was a clip of Marty McFly at like 10 in the morning doing something. He was out. I think it's when the mayor. No, it's when the guy. It's when Marty McFly's with his girlfriend by the clock tower, by the town hall, and the guy says, "Can you sign this petition to save the clock?" And that's at like 10:10, and then like half an hour later, you see Marty McFly waking up in bed because he's woken up late, which doesn't make sense, right? Like, how can he have been out in the morning and then just waking up? Because they're from different parts of the film or different films. But it's great because I think like the whole. I think it's specifically because it's Back to the Future that it's funny, because it's like he has travelled through time in the art piece as well. I don't know. I like that. Okay. I think the film has a certain amount of wit about the way it uses time and tells time, and understands that you know sort of are watching it at a certain time.
And the audience is with it.
Yeah.
And I think the audience recognizes it, or you know, certainly the audience reaction in bulk. I mean, recognized that for sure, and that was part of the joy of watching it, really.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should probably wrap up. Any last point?
Nothing last, really. I think we've kind of. I'm sad to say that I was disappointed by it, and I know that my expectations were really high, and I've been looking forward to it for a long time. So I'm sure that's part of it. But I think there is room for significant criticism of it, and I think that. Okay, I've seen 5 hours out of 24, so you know it's a bit like. You know, it's a bit like trying to talk about any film that we normally talk about having seen 20 minutes of it in a way.
Well, it's not quite the same thing.
Not quite the same thing, but you know, I've seen 5 hours of it, and I did find that too little of it seemed to me to really elevate the material it was working with, although I could completely see the ideas behind it. There are points where it's like a film, and those are great, and there are a lot of points where it's like a film project, which is not so great.
Well, I must say, I loved it, right? So I think you're right, and I agree that there is room for significant criticism, and it must be made. And, you know, for me, the two criticisms that I would make of them, first, I do think it's kind of unconsciously an imperial project in the choices that it makes, or it certainly reveals those aspects of it. It's unconscionably unrepresentational, right? I didn't kind of see any selection of gay people. Women were, I think, underrepresented. You know, certainly every time a black person appeared, it made you conscious of how little you had seen of black people. I think those are relevant criticisms. I would also kind of criticize inversely. So on the one hand, I loved being in these wonderful seats and this wonderful screen in this wonderful room and having that experience. On the other hand, it made me ultra conscious and annoyed that, you know, an art piece was getting this kind of treatment, whereas the rest of the cinema in the museum was being treated like shit. Yeah, so kind of one is a criticism of the thing itself, and another one is a criticism of what the piece brings to mind that is in spite of itself.
Can I say one thing about the women, actually? Because I know we're trying to finish, but this actually brings up a point that I think is interesting. I'm glad you reminded me of, which is that it's not just a film about trying to show you kind of different peoples and connecting them, but it's also it's about cinema, right? We didn't really think about it. It's not just, it's about cinema. And so I saw 10 till 12 and 7 till 9 in the evening, 10 till 12 in the morning, and I can certainly notice a difference between the amount of women in those times. Between 10 and 12, there's very few women, really. It's all about guys doing stuff. And between 7 and 10 in the evening, there are a lot more women. Women were, at the home preparing dinner, or women were going on dates with people. They weren't just necessarily doing the kind of stereotypical things, but they were just involved more, somehow. And they were involved less in that early kind of time in the morning. And I'm not sure that I think that's actually revealing of cinema more than it is about the film and the choices the film makes.
Okay.
Like because the film is not inventing stuff. It has to draw on what is available from cinema.
Well, I think that's true.
And I think that's interesting.
I think that's true, but I also think that within that, so it is about cinema, and the women has to be looked at and so on, and the functions that they fulfill and so on is true. But during the whole of the first 60 years of cinema, women were the dominant audience, right? So, there's a lot of films that we now call women's films, which were just films, that everybody saw, and, kind of women were a majority component of the audience in general, right? And actually, I do think that's underrepresented. So I was very conscious, for example, of the moments that you saw Joan Crawford or Marlene Dietrich, or, the wonderful moment in The Letter where kind of Betty Davis allows herself to be killed at the end, and you have that wonderful shot of the moonlight. So, those are the things that kind of you remember, but the rest of it does seem to be men, and so, for example, the clips about Laura, which is basically Dana Andrews going through the apartment and so on, and then you see Laura through the painting, and, kind of Laura comes in, brings a coat or something. That is cinema, and that's cinema. That's a problem with the representation of women in cinema. But there's lots of other choices that this filmmaker could have made, right? And I would say that to me it did seem, 80% men doing things, and that is not cinema.
I think that's probably true. I just think it's interesting. I think were I to see it again, I'll definitely kind of pay more attention to that, because I think that's interesting. I think there's a difference. There's an interesting conflict between what maybe you'd like to show and actually what is available and what the kind of preponderance of clips available to you might be.
Yes.
I think it's kind of interesting. But, it's for another time.
Anyway, on a way to end on is I would still urge everyone I know to go see it.
Yes.
It's a great work. I do think it's kind of it's the only installation piece that I have been tempted to see more than once. And
well, it's
4
certainly
times.
deeply ambitious. It's incredibly ambitious, and a lot of work has gone into it. And the fact that it, as you say, provides such a great cinematic experience within the confines of, or within the context of an art gallery, is fantastic.
Yes.
That it's not that it's. I mean, it's the thing that everyone is at the Tate to see.
Yes.
Huge queues. And,
yes.
And that's great. I don't think that just speaks to the kind of mystique it's been able to build up for a long time, because I think the fact that it, maybe this is another part that it's had such kind of good reviews and things and good press, is because it's come around so rarely.
Yeah.
That scarcity has allowed to build up a great amount of hype.
But often in art, in art in the museum, there's a great difference between the reviews and the publicity and the word of mouth.
Yeah.
And actually, I do think that this is so fascinating because the word of mouth has been terrific. I can't think of anyone who hasn't encouraged their friends to go see it.
Well, it's singular. I mean, this is what I've said to all my friends as well. Like, for all the criticisms that I have, it's a singular work.
Yeah.
And absolutely worth your time to try it out. No matter what you make of it. It's a shame to miss it.
And that might be a wonderful note to end on.
Yeah, but by the time this goes out, it won't be at the Tate anymore. So,
but it will most likely be somewhere else, and somewhere else near you.
It'll come round, and if you do get the chance to see it, it's worth going to for a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening. We are Eavesdropping at the Movies, and we are at.
We're on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Twitter and Facebook, and eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much for listening.
Bye bye.